Hi there, I'm Caroline from Stewardship and welcome to this mini-series which we have called What I Wish I Knew Before I Started Support Raising. Joining me will be Miles Wilson, who has lived on support with his wife for 45 years, 17 of which were working with Agape in Ireland and in Germany. During that time, they saw the importance of having a really strong support network around them. So after that, they moved into supporting or working with mission organizations all around the world, helping to equip them to biblically and practically understand how to do support raising well. Then we have Mike Frith with us. Mike worked with MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship, in Uganda and in Madagascar after training in the United States. After that time, he returned to the UK and set up Oscar, which is a support service for mission. It's based in the UK, but supports people all around the world. So he himself has been living on support for around 30 years as well. Then we have Jo Arkell, who works with me at Stewardship. Jo also worked for Agape in student ministry and family life ministry. So she has raised support twice herself and now is working for Stewardship. Both Jo and I are working in the individual recipients team where we support either Christian workers or Bible college students who are raising their own support. And then I myself spent 5 years in Bolivia where I raised my own support. And then I returned to the UK and worked as a missions pastor in a large church in London where I was overseeing the support of around 20 mission partners around the world. In this first episode, we're going to look at how prevalent living on just enough is amongst those who raise their own support. We're also going to look at some of the common reasons behind the issue of living on just enough. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the Bible and draw out just some of the principles or the main principles that we can gather around living on support. So I've said that many raising their own support often live on just enough. And I saw that when I was working in Bolivia, in the conversations that I had with those raising support, and also in my next role as the missions pastor. So is this just me, or is it just what I've seen, or have you guys found the same thing? So Miles, what's your experience been?
Yeah, I suppose personally back 45 years plus ago when we started raising support ourselves, we were in that situation. We didn't raise enough. We did enough to get by. And then I realized that's common of many of my colleagues, many others, which is why we actually started almost more than 25 years ago now, working with organizations across the globe. What's been interesting is that I haven't actually asked for work since 1993, because consistently every country, every mission organization faces this thing. And every week I get asked by mission organizations, can you come and help? Our staff are struggling. It is consistent, it is global, and it's sad actually that so many people in mission end up just about making it through.
Yeah, I agree, Miles. I see it quite a lot. One couple that spring to mind is they felt called to go with one organization to do a particular task, and then when they found out how much they were going to need to raise finance-wise, they decided to look for another organisation where they had to raise less. And that, I think, is the general trend. People try to work out how they can do what they're called to do, with raising as little finance as possible. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like going for a job where you look for what you can do that gets the most money. So in this case, they look for what they can do that's going to cost them the least, and ends up driving their decisions, the finance. So I think it's extremely common. I see it with my work with Oscar. I see it a lot. People needing to raise more finance because they're right down at the minimums already. They're either not raising enough or they're only just scraping by.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed it as well, having only worked at Stewardship for a short time and realising there's only 1% of our individual recipients who raise their support to the target that we set them. And so many recipients are just living on so much less. We ran a Christmas appeal. We wanted to gift something to our recipients, and that ended up being £200. And the emails that we received in response to that gift were at times quite heartbreaking. People talking about what that sort of money meant to them and what they were going to do with it. And just reading through those, you realise that if £200 makes this difference to these individuals and to these families, then they really are living on a much lower income than they should be. £200 shouldn't make that much difference to people, but it was actually at times really sad reading through some of these emails and realizing the financial situations that missionaries are living in.
Yes, living on not enough resonates with me personally too. When I was in Bolivia, I thought I was raising enough. But then when I came back and I started the role as the missions pastor, I did the stewardship training just to see what they taught on. And I had that, I wish I knew this before I started support raising. One of the key things was I wasn't raising enough for pensions and savings, which can be a common thing. So let's have a little look at what are the main reasons behind people scraping by. Maybe we can just touch on a few of those. Mike, do you want to kick us off on what might some of these reasons be?
Well, I think at the heart of it, actually, people feel it's biblically right to live on little. That's the whole premise behind what they do. Others for finance, for money, and they also think that they should be just depending on God, whatever he gives them. And so they kind of leave it like that. But the interesting thing I think happens there that I see quite a lot is they've picked isolated verses in order to back up what they've actually felt themselves. They've decided what they want to do, what they don't want to do, and they've then chosen verses that agree with that viewpoint. And then they build a whole theology around that. And so that's interesting to see. So it's really comes from a pride point of view, because they decide, I don't really want to ask for finance. I don't really want to have to raise more than I can get away with. Therefore, they start looking for verses and little isolated Bible stories that illustrate that. So I think that's one of the reasons why people arrive at this lower level.
I think, Mike, you were talking about from an individual perspective, where sometimes theology is built to justify an emotion. But it's also true at an organizational level. Most mission organizations and mission in general doesn't treat the resourcing of mission as mission itself. It's a separate thing. So they tend not to offer the training that's needed, the time that's needed, the coaching that's needed. Sometimes don't even have a theology of it. They will have a theology of church planting, but not of the resourcing of church planting. And I see this time and time again. And sometimes the leaders of organizations are the ones themselves that are struggling. They're not taking the time to work on it. So you get this, it's almost like a perfect storm of the emotions of the individual feeling difficult and uncomfortable, this whole pride, independence thing. The organizations themselves then not facilitating an overcoming of those issues, and the individuals left in the middle. And sometimes wouldn't be said like this, but it's a bit like, we want you to raise your own support. Good luck, come back when it's done. And it really is unhelpful. It for me, I see it as almost spiritually irresponsible to ask someone to do something on behalf of an organization or individuals doing it on behalf of their families and not really giving it the attention it needs. So I think it's both personal and then organizational. Organizations don't help their staff members overcome these personal issues.
Yeah, I mean, talking about those personal issues, I think for a lot of people, it just comes down to they just do not want to support raise. The whole thing makes them feel uncomfortable. They're worried about asking, they're worried about coming across begging, they're worried that they're going to maybe damage some of their friendships or relationships that they've got by asking people and by changing maybe the nature of the friendship. I think, as Mike was saying, a lot of it is pride. We like to provide for ourselves. We don't like to depend on others. Maybe we like to give more than we like to receive, but we don't necessarily follow those thoughts through. So, by holding back from asking people, we're actually taking away opportunities for other people to give, even though we might like to give ourselves. So I think sometimes there's an emotional response and people don't necessarily think through logically what the issues are.
And that's, to me, that's, as Miles says, that's because the organisations kind of send the individuals away to raise their support. And so you're left on your own, and all the emotions, all the things that you're kind of trapped by come out in that, because you're not really getting much help. And I think part of the issue there is the organisations and then subsequently the individuals say that raising support is not really part of their ministry. It's like this hurdle to get over before they get to the real ministry that they're going to do. and they miss out the whole opportunity of building a partnership team through that time that's going to really enhance their ministry down the line. And so you don't ever see it as part of what you're going to do. And that's the real issue, I think, with folk when they're left on their own. They think it's something just to get over until they get to the real work, whereas it really should be an integral part of it.
Great, thanks guys. I think that's really helpful just to touch on just a few of the reasons maybe behind people living on so little. And in our training, we go through all of that in a lot more detail and help you unpick that and see how you can change those patterns. And Mike, you touched on the Bible in that section and saying it's important to not build a theology just around kind of one or two verses to fit your experience. So I think it'd be good if we could take a look at the Bible and see what does the Bible say on support raising, or what are the main kind of principles that we could take from the Bible about support raising. So Mike, do you want to kick us off on that area?
Yeah, so the main principle in the Old Testament is the example of the Levites. Way back in Numbers 18. So in the nation of Israel, the Levites were the tribe that were called by God to leave their livelihood, their means of income that they would generate themselves, to serve full-time in the tabernacle as it was then. So they would effectively not work the land, but they would live off the tithes that other people brought to the temple. And that was the pattern that I think set up that effectively lasted for many, many years. And the New Testament kind of bases quite a bit of its theology on that principle as the sort of jumping off point. I think it's an amazing principle, and it's one that we should think about. Actually, if somebody feels called, or if God calls them to do a certain task, then there should be others that support them to enable them to do that. And can you imagine if we work by the tithe principle? You know, for every one person that gets called to serve full-time for God, it would only take 10 other people coming to the tabernacle or the temple or the church to support them full-time. If we had that in our churches, you've got a church of 100 people, you could have 10 full-time Christian workers. So it's a good principle to look at first as the jumping off point for being somebody who's called out of everybody else's situation and to live on their support.
It's great too to think, you know, we've sort of got that foundation in the Old Testament, and then we look at Jesus and his life, and, you know, here's a man who was financially supported. The Bible's very clear that he was financially supported by those around him. It mentions particularly that there were women. And you think too about the disciples, when Jesus called them to follow him, they actually gave up their paid work. And I suppose we don't necessarily always put ourselves in their shoes and think about what that must have been like for them, but to leave their job, which was financially secure, and then to rely on the giving of other people, it's amazing to see we've got that model there.
But also then you look at Paul, who was probably the first of the cross-cultural missionaries of the church age, the first major one, and how his process was funded. Antioch was the church that released him into mission, and it looks like they provided some resourcing at the beginning. But the pattern that Paul had, and you see throughout the New Testament, is that those who received the message of the gospel became the supporters that helped the person take the next step in the journey. So we see Paul being supported by the church in Philippi, was a church that he planted. He writes back to them the book of Philippians, which was a thank you letter from a missionary to their supporters, where he talks about them as partners in the gospel. And there's a huge amount, even in that book. I'd encourage you to read that book as a missionary, communicating to supporters, and think, what do I learn from that? We then see his relationship with Corinth, where they chose not to support him, and he takes them to task on that in 1 Corinthians 9, where he talks about their judgment on him. And interestingly, in 1 Corinthians 9, when writing to Corinth, he argues against the concept of tent making. Time and time again, from people who haven't actually looked at the passages, I hear, oh, Paul was a tent maker, he provided for himself. Yes, he did, but he said he shouldn't have had to have done it. To the Corinthians, he argues that who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Is it only Barnabas and I who have to work for a living? So in that particular context, his what he's communicating is the reason I had to make the tents is you guys didn't give the support. To the Thessalonians, he talks about them being a lazy bunch of people. They should go and get a job, go and work. He said, I modeled this to you. I showed you how to work. So he never upholds it as a means of supporting his ministry. He does talk about it in a discipleship context. In fact, also in 1 Corinthians 9, he said, as the Lord has commanded, those who preach the gospel should earn their living from the gospel. So it is incorrect to say Paul held this up as the model or even a primary model for funding ministry. No, it was something he did out of necessity because the supporters didn't give. And I think that's important too. If you're in a family situation and the money isn't there, you need to provide for your family. It's important to do that. But the best way to do that is to build a team of people giving to you, committed to you, who are not just donors, but are partners in the gospel with you.
That's really interesting, Miles. And I was just thinking, a common comment is, I don't know someone wealthy who can fund my work. And I think that comment shows that, again, they're not thinking of engaging others in their work and building a team of partners, but it's, I need this money so I can get on with my work. And the quickest way is one person to give me a bunch of money. And most people don't know wealthy people. And if we look at the Bible, that's not always the way it happens. In fact, there's a lot of examples of people being asked to give from very little, give all they have. And I find the story of Elijah, the widow, really interesting in that it's in 1 Kings 17, if you want to look it up. It's where God directs a widow. It says God's directed this widow to give to Elijah. And when he goes to her, he asks her, and she says, well, I'm preparing my last meal. This is all I have left, basically. And because of that, we're going to eat it. And then my son and I are going to die. So I think if God kind of told me to go and ask a certain person to give to support my work, and they say, well, this is the last bit of food I have, I would probably say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you eat that. I'll figure it out and think maybe I can get them some food. But if Elijah had done that, we know that the widow actually would have died, because what happens is he doesn't say that. He says to her, okay, well, first make me some food and then have your food. I don't think many I know would have the guts to say that. But God had told him that he had instructed this widow. So he said this kind of quite brazenly, and so she gave him the food. And then it says that the food that she did have, the oil and the flour, then it didn't run out. So there's a lot to unpack in there. There's various principles in there. I mean, God in that case did direct someone to give, and that person wasn't a wealthy person. They were on the brink of death. So there's so much in the Bible that we can look at, and to draw out different principles and to challenge maybe our own kind of thoughts and opinions. And as you were saying, Mike, earlier, it can challenge what we would rather do. We'd definitely rather not ask the dying widow. So it can help us challenge those thoughts.
I have a story of another widow, not from scriptures, but from more recent times. I was doing a workshop some years ago for the Wycliffe Bible translator staff from East Africa. So we were in Ethiopia, and there was folk there from Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania, etc. And there was a couple from the UK who were facilitating it. They weren't going through the training, they were just making sure the meals were ready on time, etc. But the wife was sitting in on the session that we dealt with, that Joe just talked about there, where we looked at the people who supported Jesus, who were women. So she thought, oh, okay. Well, we have over the years had a number of women who've supported us, single women, divorced women, widowed women. She thought, I'll focus on the women, let my husband deal with everything else. And immediately she said that, God brought a name to her mind. And she thought, no, can't be her. This was a lady back in England. She had been receiving the prayer letter from this couple for 13 years. And the lady was married to someone from Africa, I'm not sure which country, but he had been back home visiting his family but 4 years before this and had been murdered while at home. She was then on her own with 4 children, 2 of them extremely disabled, both physically and mentally. So, as you can imagine, the missionary thought, I can't ask her, just can't. But the name would not leave her mind. And God kept prompting her to contact this lady. So we were there for about 2 weeks in total. So eventually she relented and sent an email that said, you know our situation, we know your situation, you know what we're doing. We do need more people to join our partner team. I'm fully aware that your situation is quite difficult, but I didn't want to bypass you because of that. And she hesitated for a long time before hitting the send button. And we were there when the reply came back very quickly. The lady said, "Thank you so much for asking. I am weeping as I'm typing this, because for 4 years since my husband was killed, no one has asked us to do anything for them. Everyone has done stuff for us. The church has even bought a new minibus that the wheelchairs for our children can go in. People make meals for us all the time. But you are the first person in 4 years to ask us to do anything for them. Thank you. It'll only be so much per month out of my benefits. Is that okay?" We could paper the walls of the room with reasons not to ask that lady. But by asking her, it opened up something in the lady's life that had been prevented. Everyone who helped her was doing it out of goodwill and doing it for good reason and should have been doing it. But nobody stopped to think, I wonder what she has to give, rather than look at her as someone who needs to receive. Supporters are not born with an S on their forehead so you can spot them at a distance. You never know who God has in place for your support team.
Thanks, guys. That's helpful to just spend a little bit of time looking on what the Bible says on support raising and beginning to pick out some of those key principles that can help us. We spend a lot of time looking at that on our training. So today we've looked at the prevalence of those living on a little or just enough in support raising and some of the common reasons behind that. And we've just touched on the Bible and the importance of looking at the principles we can draw with regards to living on support. So next time we're going to look at some of the key challenges that those living on support come up against. And we're also going to look at the power of partnership.
And it's important to remember too that partnership is a two-way street.
That's why it comes back to the vision-driven ask. It's not about needs. It is about what God's placed in your heart for you to do and who's going to continue on that journey with you.
And I would say over the years, we have come to that point. We're choosy at who we want on our partner team, because we don't want people to just give the money and forget about it.